Just a minute, sir. Sorry, sir. Rakhi, are you there?
Yes, for sorry. Paulo, are
Okay.
you ready for live?
Yes,
Hello.
he's ready. Yes, he's ready. You can start, Rakhi.
Okay. Good evening, sir, and good evening, namaskar to everyone. I am Rakhi, representing voices from the periphery, and it's both a privilege and an honor to extend a warm welcome to you all for today's enlightening lecture on opium and empire, the East India Company's drug trade. We are deeply fortunate to have with us Professor Amar Farooqui. Professor Farooqui is a distinguished Indian historian known for his extensive work on colonial India, particularly focusing on the social and economic history of the 19th century. He has made a significant contribution to understanding colonial trade, opium economy, labor history, and the impact of British imperialism in India. Professor Farooqui has extensively explored themes such as the role of opium trade in colonial India, the working class experience, and the economic policies of British Raj. His seminal work include Opium City, the making of early Victorian Bombay, and Sindias and the Raj, famously Gwalior, from, eight, from 1800 to 1850, where he critically examines the socio-economic landscape under British colonial rule. He has also engaged with the history of colonial policies, tracing the development of Bombay, Mumbai, and its economy through the 19th century, particularly in relation to the global opium trade and the city's emergence as a key commercial hub. His research emphasized the impact of colonial economy on indigenous populations and the dynamics of imperialism. Professor Farooqi's scholarship combines economic, social, and political perspectives, providing a nuanced understanding of colonial India's economic structure and its broader global connections. He has taught at several prestigious institutions in India and remains influential in shaping the discourse on colonial economic history. With that, I extend a warm welcome to Professor Farooqui, and I invite you all to immerse yourselves in this fascinating exploration of opium and empire, the East India Company's drug trade. Thank you, sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Monisha. I'm really grateful to the Voices from the Periphery team for uh, asking me to speak, inviting me to speak. It's part of their series on history, and the theme that I'll be speaking about this evening has to do with an aspect of colonialism that gets easily uh, sort of ignored, and often in textbooks, standard textbooks, is uh, either completely missing, or you just have a couple of passing references to what was, in fact, a very major concern of the colonial state from the 1750s onwards till almost the end of the 19th century. Just to give you a very quick idea about how this figured in the colonial economy and the concerns of the colonial state. Uh, Let me first begin by pointing out that the commodity that we are referring to is a major colonial commodity that was exported from India to China. So China is the main market for this commodity. Towards the end of the 19th century, particularly during the 1880s, when the exports in fact reached their peak, nearly 100,000 chests of opium. I'll just explain what this chest is. Nearly 100,000 chests of opium were exported to China. That's about 1 lakh chests of opium. These are the official figures. This is the opium on which the colonial government earned revenue, profits, and in addition to this, there might be other opium as well, which was which is absent from the official figures. Now, when we are talking about 1 lakh chests of opium, we should it's worth keeping in mind that chests were the in the wholesale trade, opium was reckoned in chests. So a chest of opium contained almost 60 kilograms of opium. Now, please do bear in mind that opium is consumed in minuscule quantities. So when you say 60 kilograms and then multiply that by 1 lakh chests, you get an idea of the extent of the consumption of this commodity. Opium is usually consumed in minuscule quantities, something like fractions of the tola, both as an intoxicant as well as for medicinal purposes, something like 3 to 4 balls of the size of mustard seeds. So just about 3 or 4 mustard seeds. That's what would be the weight of the usual kind of consumption. So this should give you an idea of so when you say each chest contains 60 kilograms and there are about 1 lakh of chests in the China market, you should then get that should give you some idea of the magnitude of the consumption of this commodity. That's one point I would like to make. I'll come back to this issue, but before that, I do want to clarify that the opium that we are referring to is opium as an intoxicant, as a narcotic substance, as a mood-altering substance. Opium is also a very important, it produces some important chemicals, alkaloids, which have medicinal use. For instance, it produces morphine, which remains, in fact, even to this day, one of the most powerful analgesics, one of the most powerful pain relievers known to humans. Sorry? So this is so the medicinal properties of opium are equally significant. Now, the opium that was exported by the colonial government was not for medicinal uses. But this is an important point, it needs to be grasped, that this was imported as an intoxicant, as a narcotic to the China market. And I'll come back. I'll go into a little more detail on the consumption in China. But before that, I also want to point out to you that this trade has remained hidden in a lot of the writing on the economic history of the colonial period. In fact, the decline of economic history, interest in economic history, has further invisibilized opium, and it has required a literary figure to actually shed light on many aspects of the history of opium. I'm referring over here to the trilogy of Amitav Ghosh, his three novels, Sea of Poppies, River of Smoke, Flood of Fire, which on an epic scale underline the the way in which opium figured in in the history of colonialism. It's a very, very powerful critique, which he has followed up by his non-fiction work recently, and I'll perhaps conclude with that, Smoke and Ashes, which was published about a year and a half back. So it has required really the novels of Amitav Ghosh to highlight the character of this trade over a long period of time, over nearly 150 years. And for these 150 years that I'm referring to, that's from the 1750s to about 1900, opium was the second largest source of revenue for the British Indian government. The second largest source of revenue. The largest, of course, being land revenue, and around 1/5 of the revenues of the colonial government were derived from opium. So this should give you a general idea about how opium figures in the larger scheme of things of the colonial state. Before I proceed further, let me also just explain that that opium, I don't want to get into too much detail, I'll come to that, but I'm referring to production, but opium is the produce of the poppy plant. Of the various varieties of poppy, there's only one variety, the Papaver somniferum, that yields opium. Opium is the produce of the bulb of the opium, from where an incision is made, which produces a kind of sap, a gum, which is then collected and then further processed. And the processing mainly involves drying of the gum, which is yielded by the poppy plant. We'll come back to this. Now, in the colonial, when we are looking at the history of narcotics and colonialism, it is the Dutch East India Company which initiated the large-scale seaborne exports of opium to the East. The opium which the Dutch East India Company shipped from India was mainly for Southeast Asia, particularly for Indonesia, for the Indonesian archipelago, and some of it to the Malaysian archipelago, and some of it might in the last decades of Dutch involvement have made its way into China. So it's the Dutch East India Company which really initiates large-scale exports of seaborne exports of opium from India to the East. Opium was one of the several commodities that the Dutch East India Company took from India for its intra-Asian trade. As most of you would know, that one of the main objectives of the Dutch East India Company, its commercial operations in Asia, was to procure spices for the European market. But in order to procure spices for the European market. It needed to bring either bullion, precious metal, to Asian regions, which were producers of pepper, cloves, mace, nutmeg, or else it had to engage in trade, intra-Asian trade, buying commodities from one part of Asia, selling them in another, earning profits from that, which were then channelized into the purchase of spices for the European market. Now, opium began to figure in the Dutch East India Company's commercial transactions in Asia from around the 1640s. As many of you would know, the Dutch East India Company had a monopoly of the trade between Europe and Asia via the Cape of Good Hope. In the 17th century, it is the Dutch East India Company which dominated, but before that, throughout the 16th century, it was the Portuguese who controlled this route, that is the all-sea route connecting Europe with Asia via the Cape of Good Hope. The Portuguese maintained their dominant position till the end of the 16th century, after which the Dutch East India Company edged them out, and throughout the 17th century, or at least for most of the 17th century, it is the Dutch East India Company which dominated the Europe-Asia trade via the Cape of Good Hope. So during this period, that's the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company, as part of its commercial operations, is buying various commodities within Asia for the European market, but also for its intra-Asian trade. And from around the 1640s, the company begins to ship small quantities of opium to Indonesia. 1640s, the figure is somewhere around 500 pounds. A very small figure, but nevertheless, when you remember that opium is consumed in minuscule quantities, you realize that, in fact, they were beginning to cater to a market, rather open up a market which didn't exist earlier. So let's be very clear on this, that this is a new intoxicant they are introducing into Southeast Asia. And this new intoxicant gradually from 500 pounds, within a decade it increases to 1,000 pounds and so on, till it is being sold in fairly large quantities in parts of Indonesia. I will not go into the details of this Dutch trade. I mean, it's fairly well documented, and it figures the way it figures in the Dutch East India Company's operations in Indonesia. I'll just focus on the Indian part of this, the Indian end of this story, and point out to you that that most of the opium that the Dutch East India Company procures from India comes from the Gangetic region. It's from Eastern India. So they procure this opium, a large amount of their supply, in fact, from Bihar. Patna becomes their headquarters for procuring opium. But apart from Eastern India, and particularly Bihar, parts of Eastern what is present-day Uttar Pradesh, they also, so they are actually procuring this opium from the Doab area. And apart from this region, the other area, which traditionally was a producer of opium, was the Central Indian Malwa Plateau, the Malwa Plateau. So going back to, we definitely have references from contemporary accounts in the from the late 16th and definitely 17th century, which speak of the production of poppy, opium producing poppies in central India, but the Malwa Plateau in particular. So is the Malwa Plateau and the parts of the Doab, but with those located in parts of UP and all, but mainly in parts of Bihar. So that's the region from which most of this opium is procured. The history of opium being procured by the Dutch East India Company from Patna is sourced from their Patna factory. That is the record is fairly sort of that's fairly well documented, but we are still not very clear about the extent to which the Dutch East India Company was procuring opium from central India, because we do know that they did procure opium from Surat, opium which was which must have been opium coming from central India through trading networks linking central India with the west coast. So this is what we might regard as the prehistory of the colonial opium trade in opium and the shipment of large quantities of opium from these two producing areas to eastwards, initially the Indonesian archipelago and gradually to parts of China, South China. Now, the East India Company, that's the English East India Company, too began procuring opium as one of the several commodities that it used for its intra-Asian trade. So apart from textiles and other commodities, it was also procuring Indian opium for sale in Southeast Asia and gradually in parts of southern China. I might mention that China, with growing shipments of supplies of opium into China, the Chinese imperial government banned opium, the trade in opium, in the 1720s. So that is an indication. 1720s might be seen as marking the beginning of a long sort of struggle of the Chinese imperial government against to control the entry of opium into China. So 1720s is the first sort of ban that they imposed. 1729, there is it's officially prohibited, which would mean that by this time the scale on which opium was being shipped to China was fairly significant for it to be noticed by the imperial court. The Dutch and the English East India Company together continued to sort of buy quantities of opium in parts of eastern India. And then 1757, after the Battle of Plassey, the English East India Company obviously managed to get to corner most of the supplies of opium in this region. Following the conquest of Bihar and of Bengal, they were able to corner most of the supplies. Some of these supplies, they sort of set aside a small quota for the Dutch East India Company, but thereafter the Dutch East India Company really, in the latter half of the 18th century, really its participation in the opium trade begins to decline steadily and comes to an end by the 1790s. By which time, of course, the Dutch East India Company itself is comes to an end. Now, in the 30 years or so after the Battle of Plassey, 3 decades, in a period of 3 decades after the Battle of Plassey, the English East India Company tried various experiments, and I'm not going to go into the details of these experiments, for maximizing the procurement of opium in eastern India, in the territories that it controlled in eastern India. Its experiments but also aimed at ensuring that they were able to procure this opium at the lowest possible price. So there are a series of experiments that they carry out till eventually in the 1790s, they impose an official monopoly. So by the time you can come to the 1790s, the opium produce of Eastern India, all the territories that were controlled by the English East India Company, which had also brought parts of Eastern, what is now Eastern Uttar Pradesh, under its control. All the opium produced in this region became a monopoly, was officially a monopoly of the East India Company. When you say monopoly, it was not just the trade in this in the commodity, but the production of opium was strictly regulated by the East India Company. Opium could only be grown by, could only be produced by obtaining a license from the East India Company. So by the 1790s, between 1797 and 1799, actually there are two important pieces of legislation. The opium is declared to be an official monopoly of the state, and opium can only be cultivated, poppies can only be cultivated, that is opium producing poppies can only be cultivated by obtaining a license from the company in its territories. And this license specified the area to be sown and the amount of opium that was to was produced was to be then handed over to the East India Company. So the company itself, that's the state, had to all this opium had to be then supplied to the company. No private trade was allowed, and all this opium, the opium produced, had to be handed over to the company. So a license had to be obtained. And let me sort of obtained sounds as if these are people who were sort of who voluntarily were very keen to produce opium. It's the other way around, really. Licenses were thrust upon peasants. So these are small peasant households which really set aside a small patch of their land for cultivating poppies. Poppy requires very fertile soil. So the most fertile parts of a village would be set aside for poppy cultivation. So it's peasants with who had fertile land, and on their patch of land, the most fertile portion of the land. But it's not just that it requires very fertile soil, but also it needs a great deal of watering. So it is the most well irrigated parts of the village which would usually be set aside for the cultivation of poppies. And this opium production is actually back-breaking work. It's extremely labor intensive, which is one of the reasons why peasants were quite reluctant to cultivate this opium, particularly because the kind of remuneration that they receive for handing over the opium to the East India Company was didn't even sometimes cover the cost of production. How they control this, to explain that, let me just sort of give you an idea about how this system operated. So the company by the end of the 1790s had introduced what they call the agency system. The agency system meant that there was an opium agency. In fact, they established two opium agencies in Eastern India, and henceforth I'll be using the what might be called the brand name for this opium. That's the brand name under which it is sold in the China market, and all the sort of international transactions. In the international transactions, you have this brand name, that is Bengal opium. Although no opium was produced in Bengal. But what this implied really was opium produced in the Bengal presidency. So Bengal opium, which in turn had, there were two sort of sub-brands, you might say. One Patna opium and the other Banaras opium. So this was the opium which was the produce of these two opium agencies. So there was an opium agency called the Patna Opium Agency, which was the headquarters, Patna being the headquarters of the opium producing region of Bihar. And for Eastern India, it was the Banaras agency, although the actual headquarters were in Ghazipur, in neighboring Ghazipur. So what was sold as Banaras opium was really that for which Ghazipur acted as the headquarters. So two agencies were established, and each agency had under it a number of sub-agencies, saying something about this is important because that would give you an idea of how control was exercised right down to the village level. So each agency, each of these two agencies was, that is the Patna agency and the Banaras agency, were then divided into sub-agencies. The number varied, from time to time, but towards the end of the century, you have 16 sub-agencies in what became the United Provinces, and 11 sub-agencies in the Patna agency. That's mostly Bihar. No opium was produced in Bengal. In Bengal proper, no opium was produced. In fact, right at the outset, in the late 18th century, the company had prohibited the cultivation of opium in Bengal. So there are these sub-agencies. The sub-agency was under a sub-deputy opium agent. So that term might sound, as if it's a low-level officer. In fact, the sub-deputy opium agent was the head of a sub-agency and a very powerful colonial official. So all these are, of course, employees of the company in the civilian side of the East India Company's establishment, and the sub-deputy opium agent was a very, very powerful official. Usually, they're just called deputy opium agents. The head opium agent was, of course, the head of the agency itself, and within each sub-agency, the collector, one of the collectors, would be the head of the sub-agency. Sub-agency corresponded more or less to the boundaries of a district. The sub-agency in turn had its lower level officials who were all recruited from among Indians. So the control is vested in European officials, servants of the company, and they, at the lower level, at the village level, and at the levels below the sub-agency, it's the Indian officials who handle most of the work. Now, this became a kind of state within a state. Each sub-agency had its own personnel, and I won't go into too many details about the personnel, but these included guards, these included local revenue officials, these included those who kept revenue records, these included policemen, these included the sort of lathi-wielding personnel, the lather in these regions. So these were the people who actually policed the villages and ensured that peasants cultivated the amount of the plot that had been sort of indicated in their licenses, the patta, and this opium was then sort of watched over very carefully while the poppy plants were growing. Now, poppy is a rabi crop. It's sown. It's a winter crop. It's sown in November, and the produce is usually collected around February. So February would be the time. So February would be the time when the village level personnel would be very, very active. They would be monitoring. There would be the amount of surveillance is enormous. The amount of surveillance at the village level is really enormous. In fact, the opium establishment made it possible for the colonial state to exercise surveillance on a massive scale at the village. So these personnel, apart from the officials who are paid by the opium establishment at the village level, there are also well-to-do peasant cultivators who also are sort of co-opted into this system, because this involves a lot of sort of spying, intelligence, keeping track of how much is being cultivated, is it being collected, is it being handed over to the company or not, all those aspects which involved a great deal of surveillance, but it also involved telling on each other. So there were these sort of well-to-do peasants who, some of whom might have been literate, who were, who had some sense of the records that were maintained by the opium establishment at the village level, and very often they also acted as informers. So this establishment, this is an establishment that really sort of penetrates deep into rural society. In fact, we still need a good kind of social history of the opium establishment and the way that it operated in the at the village level. Unfortunately, our the research on the opium economy in the countryside is actually very, very limited. Only recently, Austrian scholar Rolf Bauer has actually produced a very detailed account of the opium economy in Bihar, but we lack a similar kind of work for parts of the United Provinces and certainly for parts of central India. So there's actually a great paucity of research on this, despite the fact that the colonial records are very, very extensive on opium, because the colonial state really maintained very close watch on the production of opium. So these opium agencies were also acted as collection centers. Now, again, I won't go into too much detail on this, but throughout the countryside, there were under these opium, there were in these sub agencies, there were a large number of collection depots. So peasants from a group of villages were expected to then travel to the depot, hand over the opium which had been collected in the raw form. In the raw form, it's a kind of semi-liquid state, placed inside earthen pots, matkas, and these matkas, these earthen pots, had then to be carried to the depot. Now, once this the raw opium the opium gum was handed over to the depot. The depot was the East India Company depot, the official sort of government depot. Once it was handed over, the role of the peasant came to an end with that. They had nothing to do with the processing of opium. So they only grew the poppy plant and collected the yield from the poppy plant, which, as I've already mentioned to you, is a really back-breaking work. It requires intense labor. It also requires considerable skill. It's a very, very sort of specialized kind of work. But then, obviously, there were sections of the peasantry in these regions which had acquired these skills for generations, and they were able to collect this the sap or the gum from the plant, and which was then scraped and then put into the matkas. And once it's had a certain amount of this sap or this gum had been collected, it would then be in each matka. Then all these earthen pots would then be taken to the company's collection depot, local collection depot, and handed over to the collection depot. That's where the the peasants' role ended. Of course, the peasants still had to be paid, and that also required a great deal of negotiation because I mean, that's the sort of site of considerable struggle because the opium, the official establishment tended to reduce the price, the official sort of officially declared price, by constantly claiming that a part of the opium was adulterated. So a great deal of testing of the opium, and one of the jobs of the opium establishment was all this testing that had to be done. And in that process, the peasants were always the losers because there was a tendency to sort of to sort of reduce declare that the opium was not really in its purest form, that it was adulterated in various ways. So that also is an interesting story, the constant tussle which goes on at the depot for the for receiving the payment. Of course, they are not paid immediately. The opium will then be tested. It will be tested at several points. After it is tested at several points, then the price would be determined, and eventually, towards the end of the season, which would be actually the August of of the following year, they would be, after several months, the peasants would receive their remuneration, which often was not really remuneration for what they had produced. So this so once it had reached the depot, the company then took over the opium. All this opium would then be collected at the depot and then be further transported to the opium factory. At the opium factory, so there are two opium factories in eastern India. The factory at Patna and the factory at Ghazipur. The Ghazipur factory was functional till very recently. And I might mention over here that India remains a major producer internationally of legal opium for medicinal purposes. So this India continues to produce opium in its alkaloid factories, officially controlled by the government, which is intended for exclusively for medicinal purposes. So, and that function is a kind of the shift that took place in the early 20th century when the opium trade was outlawed. A lot of this opium was then being used for the production of for morphine, but for other sort of chemicals that are yielded by the poppy plant. So the company then, once the opium had been taken from the peasant at the depot, it would then be transported to the factory. We have interesting descriptions. In fact, in A Sea of Poppies, some of you have read, I'm sure some of you have read Sea of Poppies, there is a magnificent description of the functioning of the opium factory at Ghazipur. We also have a description of the Ghazipur factory, which was given by Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling in 1888 visited the Ghazipur factory and gives an account of this, and he actually says in that they are constantly testing, constantly weighing, constantly sort of examining the opium. I mean, that was a very major part of the functioning of the opium factory. So we also have, incidentally, from the 1850s, two sets of illustrations of the work in the Patna factory. Both are from the 1850s. One of these was a set of drawings which was done for the great exhibition in London, 1851, when a surveyor of the company by the name of Sherwell was commissioned to produce a set of drawings for the the functioning of the opium factory in Patna. And a few years later, the same factory, which for which another artist, and this was an Indian artist by the name of Shivalal, who was, these paintings, by the way, are very easily available on the internet. I thought that I would sort of do a kind of PowerPoint kind of thing, but they're so easily available, that so easily accessible, that you can do your own search and have a look at these drawings. One by Sherwell of the Patna factory, and the other by Shivalal. The Shivalal collection, both these Shivalal collection is at the Victoria Albert Museum. Another set is in the British Museum, and he's in fact, interestingly, it is art historians who have paid a little more attention to the work processes, the labor processes, production processes that are depicted in these paintings, particularly the Shivalal drawings, and rather than economic historians. But it's worth seeing these paintings. That will give you an idea of how what went on in these opium factories. Because this is specifically on Patna, and we have these two sets, more or less contemporary. They come from the 1850s, one from the early 1850s, one from 1856, one by a European surveyor, an employee of the company, and another by an Indian artist by the name of Shivalal. So it might be worthwhile if you are sort of interested to do a Google search, and you'll get these paintings. At least some of them you'll be able to see. Now, so this opium would then be, once it had been produced, it would then be taken to Calcutta. Incidentally, one of the drawings in the Sherwell set is of opium boats being, a large convoy of boats taking the opium from Patna to Calcutta along the river. So it'll give you, that would give you an idea of how this large convoys would then be transporting it along the river to Calcutta. At Calcutta, the opium was then the opium had already been packed in these factories in these large chests, each chest weighing 160 pounds. But please remember that all the the weight included a lot of packaging material also, which came from the poppy plant itself. So a lot of the packaging material itself came from the poppy plant. So the stems and so on, they would be dried, and that would be used as packaging material. So there's very specific net weight which each chest has, which is of 160 pounds. That's roughly sort of a little less than 80 kilograms. But then a part of those 80 kilograms was the packaging material. And the opium itself would be about 60 kilos. Once it had reached Calcutta, the opium was then auctioned. Now that's an important point. It was auctioned to private dealers. The important point is the East India Company did not directly ship this opium to China because it is a contraband trade. So it was not shipped directly to China by the company. It was auctioned to private dealers, Indian and European, who then took the risk of transporting it to China, where it was then given to, there's a complex set of transactions which takes place, which I'm not going to go into, but I'll just briefly touch on that when I come to Western India. So it is given to firms which then take over the task of having the opium smuggled into China, because it's contraband. It's a prohibited item. So it has to be smuggled into China. But when I say that the East India Company kind of just sold off the opium to private dealers and then had nothing to do with, this needs to be placed within the larger context of the company's engagement in opium. The opium was smuggled into China under the company's patronage, by which I mean, and its protection, by which I mean that whenever there was a major dispute, as happened in 1839, leading to the first Opium War, the company stepped in. Not only did the company step in, the British state stepped in. And the Opium War of 1839-1842, the first of a series of Opium Wars, was an affair of the British government. London took the decision, which should again give you an idea about the way in which opium was so important to the international colonial economy. So private traders dealt in it, but ultimately they were assured of the backing, the protection of the East India Company, not only of the East India Company, of the British government, as happened in 1839. Very quickly, I might mention that in China, the opium trade was was confined to the region around Canton. Canton was the only port that was open to foreign trade, and European and American traders, they were allotted a strip of land on the waterfront in Canton, where you had a number of factories, the so-called 13 factories, which were kind of godowns and come offices of these various companies. So there was the English, the Dutch, the Danish, the American, and so on. And that is where the opium transactions are made, although the opium was not brought into Canton. It would usually be offloaded onto smaller boats and then smuggled into China. That part of the story is very well researched, particularly in the context of the Opium Wars. While this trade was expanding, and it was expanding, in a century or so after Plassey, this massive expansion of opium exports to China, but from India. Most of the opium now is going to China. It's not going to Indonesia. And it's all done by the British Indian government, the East India Company. But towards the end of the 18th century, that's the 1790s, you will recall that that's when the agency system is established. That's when the monopoly is established. It's around that time that the company is alerted to the existence of a rampant to an extensive trade in opium from Western India. So while it is establishing its monopoly, while it is opening up the market in China to push in the opium, there are also traders on the West Coast who are making use of this opportunity to procure opium from Central India, from the Malwa region, and export it to China. Now that begins to threaten the company. That threatens to undermine the company's monopoly. And the company has to actually struggle for several decades to figure out a solution to what to do with that opium. They initially tried to prohibit all export of opium via the sea from the West Coast. That fails. They then try to procure all the opium from Central India and sell it on their account at Bombay. So they initiate auctions of opium grown in Malwa, which the brand name was Malwa opium, which is then bought by the company and then sold at Bombay, auctioned at Bombay in the same way as Calcutta. That also fails because they can't procure all the opium. from central India. One of the problems is that this is in central India, the area which produces opium was entirely under princely rule. So British control over this, direct control over this area was very was a problem. They didn't control this area in the same way as they did Eastern India. So they are unable to sort of restrict traders from procuring this opium and sort of using other routes to convey this opium to the coast. They try to impose sort of treaties on the princely states in central India. That also fails. They are unable to control the routes that link central India with the west coast. So all those problems which make it very difficult for them to regulate this opium. So eventually, the solution that they find is to impose a transit duty. So all opium from Malwa can then, from the 1830s, was allowed to pass legally through through Bombay on the payment of a duty. So it's a transit duty, and all this opium could only be re-exported. This could only be brought for re-export on the payment of a duty, and then re-export and shipped to China. So that's a different part of the story, but that story is also linked to the rise of Bombay, because a large number of traders in Bombay benefited from this trade. They first kind of gate crashed into this trade, and then they sort of became important participants, and they had important links with the China trading companies. One of these trading companies, that's European trading companies operating in China, the most powerful of which was a company by the name of Jardine Matheson. That's a firm which actually and its offices actually figure prominently in the second part of Amitav Ghosh's trilogy, that's River of Smoke. So they have important links, and it has been possible to sort of study their transactions with the traders in Bombay, with their traders in Calcutta, because of a very rich archive that is available. That's the Jardine Matheson archive. So cumulatively, there's a huge amount of opium that's going to China from Eastern India, which is a monopoly of the company. Later on, after 1858, it's a monopoly of the British Indian government. And then there is opium from Malwa opium going from Bombay, on which the company earns a certain revenue earned from the transit duties on this opium. Now, in the latter half of the century, so this is the story of opium during the period of company rule, but I just want to sort of towards the end spend about 5 or 7 minutes saying something about what happens in the latter half of the century. So this trade actually continues, and the China market is also opened up further after the first Opium War. Then the second Opium War, 50s, it's sort of further opened up. Although technically opium was never legalized, the trade was never sort of legalized in China, but a great deal of opium was going from to designated ports in China from India, both from Western India as well as from Central India, and China began producing its own opium as well. So that added to the consumption. Again, I'm not getting into that story, but it's important to keep that in mind, because that also explains the. It's important to for another part of the story, which is related to the growth of a very powerful movement against the opium trade, which had more to do with China. So what opium is doing to China became an important part of this sort of campaign internationally for putting an end to the opium trade, because of the effect that it was having on China. There were people in China itself who were articulating a very strong critique of this trade, or how it is destroying China. In fact, the stereotype was, that the Chinese take easily to this and that kind of stereotype became important to the opium lobby. There was another kind of argument, which was that opium is not really so harmful. It's the overconsumption of opium, which leads to problems. And as a result of this growing campaign, which had a few figures from India as well. In fact, among the early nationalists, the most important critic of the opium trade was Dadabhai Naoroji. Dadabhai Naoroji was a very strong critic of the opium trade. But then there were other figures whose histories are only now being researched and focused on. There is an anti-opium activist based in Western India, in Pune, by the name of Sundarbai Pawar, who incidentally was a very close associate of Ramabai Pandit. So it's only now that people are beginning to take an interest on her involvement, Sundarbai Pawar's involvement in the anti-opium campaign. So this became a very powerful campaign with international linkages, and these networks were able to exercise sufficient influence to be able to force the British government, I'm talking here of London, to set up a royal commission. So in 1893, a royal commission on opium was set up, and this commission, now it's important to see this difference. So a lot of the campaign is about what opium is doing to China. The Royal Commission on Opium was about India. So the entire narrative in that, and the way the evidence is collected and the report prepared, is not about China. Although all this opium is going to China. There was some small amount of opium incidentally reserved for domestic market, but that's not so important to our story. But the bulk of it is going to China. And the international campaign was about, the need to put an end to this trade because of what it is doing to China. The Royal Commission of Opium focused its attention entirely on India. Production, consumption, sale, revenues. So this Royal Commission on Opium toured India for about 1.5 years, collected evidence, and this is very extensive evidence, very useful for researchers. The Royal Commission on Opiums has 7 massive volumes of evidence, but it's also something which tells us about how these commissions function. So the way in which the witnesses were identified, the way in which the questions were framed, all these were intended to ultimately show that opium, as far as the Indian Empire, British Indian Empire is concerned, is in fact a necessity. It's necessary for its economy. Revenues will suffer. If the revenues of the government suffer, then people will suffer. Not only that, some very dubious medical evidence was also witnesses were called to provide evidence about opium not being very dangerous in terms of its consumption. So very dubious kind of evidence, which then became the medical evidence, which found its way into the report, where opium doesn't figure as a very dangerous kind of substance. I mean, the Chinese really don't, the point they were making was the Chinese don't really know how to use opium. They become addicts. But in India, people have been traditionally using it, and moderate use is perfectly okay. It's used for medicinal purposes, and it's not more dangerous than alcohol. And people, only because they start consuming large quantities, they become addicts. That kind of statement. And medicinally, it's not something that's very. In fact, it's very good. But the point is that this was not about opium as a medicine. The entire argument, the entire thrust of the campaign against opium, and the critique was the use of opium as an intoxicant. So in these ways, the entire purpose of that Royal Commission on Opium was subverted. It didn't really sort of bring out anything that might lead to action in terms of putting an end to the opium trade or curbing the international trade in opium. Henceforth, the story is one of mounting pressure. I can't go into the details of that, but by 1912, there was a consensus internationally that opium as an intoxicant is something that is bad. It ought to be banned, restricted, and then the League of Nations then. Under the auspices of the League of Nations, subsequently of the First World War, series of sort of international treaties, which led to the outlawing of opium. So it's really during the interwar period that then opium trade was outlawed internationally. It became a banned substance in terms of use as an intoxicant, as a narcotic. Only its production for medicinal use was allowed, which again was to be regulated by an international machinery, very, very sort of closely monitored. And the broad sort of contours of that policy continue to be function down to the present time. I'll end by coming back to Amitav Ghosh and referring to his latest work, not his latest work, I mean his latest work on opium, Smoke and Ashes, in which he has refers to, apart from other things, so this is a non-fiction work. It's really about his engagement in research and so on opium over a long period of time. Because his novels are actually very, very well researched. They're based on solid historical research. In Smoke and Ashes, he talks about his own sort of work and so on, his engagement with, the history of this commodity, and then he mentions his the family connection that he has with Bihar. So his family originally from East Bengal relocated to Bihar, to the region of Saran. Now, the Saran region was in western Bihar, was a major opium producing area. And there his family, his father, his grandfather were based in Chhapra. And he sort of talks about how this was initially sort of his interest in that region was, and his connection with Bihar was because of his interest in indenture, which figures prominently again in his novels, particularly in the first novel, that's Sea of Poppies. But then he refers to how gradually, as he sort of researched further his own family's involvement and the opium enterprise, he realized that one of the reasons why people from Bengal, particularly those who were educated, who could be useful for paperwork, who could be useful for legal work, migrated to Chhapra, was because this was an important opium producing area. So a lot of their work must have been somehow related to opium, and the large amount of paperwork that it required, including a lot of the litigation that was involved in opium production. And it's not really surprising. This obviously was such an important part of rural life in Bihar, and it generated its own tensions. And I would just like to end by mentioning that in 1857, these tensions sort of were surfaced during the revolt, tensions generated by opium production and what it had done to the rural economy, what it was doing to peasants. And in 1857, when at Patna, the first uprising took place in July 1857, the first target of the rebels was the opium factory. The first target of the rebels in Patna. 1857 July. This is known as Piral, the revolt led by Pirali, the uprising of Pirali. The first target is the opium factory, the hated opium factory, where an important functionary of that factory, a person by the name of Robert Lyle, was the first, sort of among the first Europeans to be killed by the rebels. Now, this, in a lot of writings on 1857 in the context of Bihar, usually this connection with the opium economy of Bihar gets ignored. So what it had done, the exploitative sort of character, the oppressive character of the opium establishment, and how it was such a hated establishment that it's not surprising that for the rebels this was the major target of the company's authority, and therefore attacked. And Robert Lyle was killed. Incidentally, I might mention this set of paintings by drawings by Shivlal, which I had mentioned, were actually commissioned by Robert Lyle, who seems to have been the patron of Shivlal. So I'll end over here, and if there are questions, if there are sort of any observations, comments, we can sort of do that in the time remaining to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the lecture. It's really an interesting one, and it's a really interesting one. It's provoking also. So now I will proceed to the Q&A session. I will ask our audience to unmute themselves, and they can also ask the questions, or they can write to the chat box, and I will read for the questions if they have any questions. And for our YouTube and Facebook viewers also, if they have any questions, they can post in the comment section, so we can just read the question. So we have one question in our YouTube channel. It's asked by Shantan Shorkar. So can I ask the question, sir?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, sir. So he's asking that Amitabh Bachchan's Ibis trilogy dismantled the sanitized economic narrative of the opium trade by foregrounding the brutal realities of forced cultivation, inbuilt servitude, and imperial profiting. Yet, mainstream historiography still often treats the East India Company's opium enterprise as an unfortunate and inevitable byproduct of global capitalism. Does Ghosh's literary intervention expose a deliberate erasure within historical discourse? Are historians complicit in perpetuating an economic reductionism that conveniently sidesteps the sheer scale of violence, ecological devastation, and social engineering embedded in the opium trade? Sir.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Now, the point is that, first of all, when I read these novels, for me, you read them, of course, one reads them as literature and as novels, but for someone who's interested in the history of the opium trade, one also reads them as a critique of opium of the opium economy. And first of all, one needs to sort of be very careful in terms of when you're dealing with the divide, this is literature, and when we are talking about when we are talking about the impact that opium had on in terms of the colonial economy, I think we need to keep in mind that this is these are not history texts. I mean, that's something he does in Smoke and Ashes, where he sort of reflects on his engagement with the opium question and the opium economy. But I would say that this is a work which actually does offer a major critique. It comes out very clearly, the connections that he shows, and it's a story that sort of, as you would know, links production areas with the Indian Ocean, with indenture, with Mauritius, with China. So it's the larger word of colonialism, and is something that Ghosh is trying to portray. And in that world, opium figures so prominently. In fact, by the time you come to the second part of the trilogy, you will see, in fact, there's a shift in focus. From indenture, opium becomes the key theme in his novel, and it sort of culminates in the third part, the Flood of Fire, where he sort of directly takes you on to the conflict of 1839-41, because he doesn't go up to 42, he stops at 41. Really, that's the first phase of the war. And it's a powerful critique. I mean, the way in which lives are disrupted, the ways in which the violence that is embedded in colonial rule, all that is brought out very vividly. So I see that as an important intervention by a literary figure in terms of a history that is largely forgotten, and this was no byproduct. Let's be very clear of this. It was not an unfortunate byproduct. It was central to opium. In fact, as Karl Trocky, who's a fierce critic again of opium trade, and in the last few decades is one of the few sort of scholars who has focused on opium, points out that without opium, there would have been no empire. One could then see the other linkages as well. Opium being sold to China for tea, where again in the as a new market in the new market for tea in Britain, where it has become a beverage of mass consumption by the beginning of the 19th century. Late 18th, early 19th century, the way in which, the late 18th century, coinciding again with the Industrial Revolution, the linkage that this has with the sugar production in the West Indies, the connection that has with slavery, and the Atlantic slave trade. So it's a commodity which also has important linkages with other colonial networks, whether it is the tea trade, the slave trade, sugar trade, and of course the Industrial Revolution in Britain. So to remove that would actually lead to a serious problem in terms of all these linkages. By the way, I think it's also important to remember that opium was important to the remittance of tribute from the colony to England. So I think in that sense, so I do see this as a very strong critique, and it comes out very sharply in his non-fiction work, in which he offers reflections on the history of opium and his own engagement with that history.
Thank you, sir, for the answer. And we have some questions in our chat box.
Yeah.
So Shayan Parial asking a question that could you elaborate on how Indian laborers engaged in the trading industry have been represented? Additionally, is there an archive that preserves their own narratives, especially those highlighting instances of the dehumanization by trading companies? Any literary references other than Amitabh Ghosh?
Yeah, so the archive is of course very rich, but again, the opium producers, the peasants, don't figure in that at all. If they figure at all, it's only as passing references that we have. For instance, in the evidence of the Royal Commission on Opium, or in the kind of and here I would actually say that it's the archive that you have for Central India is a fascinating archive because, in fact, when the British are trying to grapple with this problem of how do you acquire the opium produce of Malwa. So after 1818, after the Third Anglo-Maratha War, the British actually, the East India Company, tried to coerce the princely states of Central India into signing treaties through which they could then access the opium. Now, this became very difficult for them. So what they are actually doing is they are sending out their personnel into the main sort of local markets to procure the opium. So they try to procure that opium on their own account, for which they have to send these their own personnel who actually happen to be local sort of like gomashtas and so on, to procure the opium. Now, their reports are actually is where we get some idea about the way in which the rural economy works. So peasants tied to local money lenders, who in turn buy up the entire crop even before it has been sown. And then that gets, of course, the story of the local money lenders is then tied to speculation and so on. But that's where we actually can get a glimpse of what this meant to the local sort of to the peasants. For instance, you have instances of peasants not wanting to sow their land with with poppy. Their plants being whatever they've sown is then uprooted, and instead they are compelled to plant opium, or their reluctance to use the best the most well irrigated areas for lands for opium for poppy cultivation. So that archives is important. On the other hand, I would actually say, even though this material is very rich, even for Eastern India, because you do have this village level surveillance which I was referring to. Yet, in the case of Eastern India, there is, I would say, actually a tendency on the part of local level officials to conceal the way in which peasants are resisting the sort of imposition of these opium licenses. So that is something which, since they tend to conceal, but in concealing also they reveal a great deal about the kind of problems that this machinery encounters. Unfortunately, as I said, a lot of this material remains unutilized. It's only for the Saran district in particular that Rolf Bauer recently has looked at it. A lot of the work which got done earlier, right from B.B. Chaudhary's commercialization of agriculture and subsequently some of the articles by J.F. Richards, they haven't really looked very in great detail at some of these records. A lot of this is more to do with policy than with the actual sort of ground level situation in the villages as far as production is concerned. So that's the archive which I would say. But the Royal Commission on Opium also has considerable amount of material. Otherwise, unfortunately, as I said, this is something that remains inadequately explored. Given the importance of this of opium to the colonial economy, it's really surprising that it hasn't. You don't really have an extensive scholarship, historical scholarship on this issue, on this question. And then there is Indian reformers. Intermediaries in the trade as manifestation, caught in a bad. Yeah, it is. I mean, this is uh, the the many of these intermediaries are actually the collaboration and conflict that they that it's really a story of collaboration and conflict. They have to collaborate, but then they are, in a sense, they are great gate crashers. The British don't want them in this trade. And in the case of Bombay, with which, where the story is actually, I mean, with this collaboration conflict is much, much clearer, and what, this, these manifestations of mimic men, caught in this paradoxical situation. I think, this is something that we need to see. So here are these traders who are unwanted participants. They get into this trade, and once they get into it, and here I'm talking specifically of Bombay, they have to use British networks. They have to rely on firms like Jardine Matheson, who have connections with, other European firms, and have a direct line to the British government in London. Yet they have serious problems in terms of remitting their profits back to Bombay, because this machinery, the entire sort of network of which allows these remittances to take place, is one that is geared to the the remittances are geared in a way which are which are linked to the international financial transactions based in London. And the Indian merchants, people like Jamshedji Jijiboy, find it extremely difficult to remit their profits, particularly after 1833, when the company's treasury in Canton closed down with the the 1833 the Charter Act, which put an end to the China monopoly. The company then closed its Canton treasury. Earlier, the Canton treasury was where they could sort of deposit their profits, get a bill of exchange, which could then be encashed in Bombay or in Calcutta. But that closed after 1833-34. And it became extremely difficult for them. I'm not going to get into the problems that they faced, but this exclusion then made them resort to other means for doing this, till to sort of remit their profits, till eventually by the 1840s, 1850s, actually they are out of this trade. That's one part of the story of this collaboration, and their the way in which they inhabit that space, which is space which makes things they are there and yet they are not there. And then there is the other problem that they have. When the initially, when the after 1800, the British actually prohibited the export of opium from ports on the west coast. And till 1818, the British didn't really have, the company didn't have extensive territorial control in this region, so they couldn't really implement this. But after 1818, when they're trying to themselves get into this trade in Malwa, and procure all the Malwa opium, they block these ports as well, and the routes that link central India with the west coast. The British, the Indian merchants, they work out their own sort of they carry out their subversion is a form of resistance, really, where they then work out a circuitous route which links with central India through Rajasthan, through the Thar, with Karachi, and along the coast to Daman, which was actually a Portuguese enclave, and then using Daman to transport the opium to Macau, which again was a Portuguese outpost on near Canton. Now, this sort of ingenious kind of attempt to subvert the controls that have been imposed by the company is something which is a form of resistance. It makes things very difficult for the company. Eventually, in fact, there is one argument that that in 1839 the annexation of Karachi was speeded up because of the Karachi having become a major transit point for this opium that was being smuggled by. So there's a new kind of smuggling network. One is the smuggling network in China, but then there is Indian merchants of Central India, from Western India, creating their own smuggling network, which then links them to China, and using sort of the residual strength of the Portuguese and the residual networks of the Portuguese to be able to achieve that. The arguments about Indian reformers against. So what were the ethical and moral arguments? How did Indian physicians balance the benefits and risks before the British? I'll come. These are two very different questions, but let me first talk about these ethical and moral arguments. So, Dadabhai Nauroji's own critique is actually in terms of how opium is sort of part of this whole mechanism for realizing tribute. And the moral argument is partly about China, but it's also, he actually has an awareness of this, Indians, when they become complicit in the drugging of Chinese. That is a moral issue. But I don't really think that, some of those other critiques, as for instance, that of Sundarbai Pawar, is so much about China. It's about what opium addiction does to the Indian family. So it becomes a critique of the opium trade in terms of which is similar to, which has, shares a lot in terms of its sort of ethical and moral concerns with the temperance movement, with the evangelical concern about what alcohol does to families, to the individual, to the soul. All those things figure in this as well. So I think that is the focus of people like Sundarbai Pawar, who is a critic, is an activist. She's imprisoned when they protest again. When the Royal Commission of Opium was collecting evidence, some of these people were actually they were put under house arrest. So the colonial state comes down very strongly against all these people who are opposed to the opium trade and who are seen as part of this anti-opium lobby. But what is important, I think, and that's something that this recent work by Stephen Rimner, Rimner, Opium's Long Shadow, actually shows that rather than focus specifically on the writings of because his focus is more on Sundarbai Pawar, is to rather focusing on what she's actually saying in her pamphlets or in other articles and so on. She also went to England and sort of as part of this campaign. We need to see how she was important to the international linkages that were established for developing a campaign against the opium trade, in which, in fact, in that the anti-opium sort of campaign, a lot of the focus has to do really with China, what it is doing to Chinese society. So in that sense, she and sort of some of the other activists, they actually share that kind of an ethical position of what opium does to it's wrong to say that opium is not harmful. It destroys the family, it destroys the individual. It has, addiction brings with it its own sort of problems. All those things figure in her critique. So a lot of what was related to China is really sort of reproduced in the context of India. But then in the context of India, again, this is a time which sees, I'm talking the 1880s, 1890s, a lot of writings coming up which talk about opium dens, which talk about, these people who sort of, once they're addicted, you can't really sort of, it's impossible to retrieve them. They become useless for society. And of course, there's always, please do remember, I think this is something that we all know, that's the critique of alcohol as well, and of part of the temperance movement, that this is they are unable to provide useful labor. So it's also about useful labor. Yeah, Indian. Now that would take us to a different. Indian physicians balance the benefits and risks of opium use. Now, I'm really, I really don't have an answer to that, because I think that needs to be further studied, because I think even though there's so much work on the social history of medicine. Pre-colonial usage of opium has not received adequate attention. And I might say over here, I might add to this by also saying, there is this kind of, so it is used. We know that opium is used. We also have, incidentally, from Portuguese records, from Goa, the use of opium as a painkiller, particularly in the Portuguese infirmaries, that's in their dispensaries on the West Coast, particularly at Goa. We do have records, which give details of its medical use. But this question of balance requires much more details. It's used for, it's an important cough suppressant. It's used for various kinds of ailments like diarrhea. It's used for as a painkiller for rheumatism. In the 1870s, 1880s, in fact, it was also being projected as a cure for malaria. And one particular extract from opium, which is actually, opium contains several alkaloids. So one of the extracts was a chemical called noscapine. So noscapine was being sort of projected as a cure for malaria. So suddenly the government started encouraged more cultivation of opium, so that more noscapine could be extracted from opium. But this balance is a tricky question, and I really don't have an answer to that. There is, of course, the other kind of evidence that we have of elite usage of opium as an intoxicant, which also has its own problems, which because the British could then say that, well, actually opium was widely used. I mean, they actually tended in their records, in their writings, to exaggerate elite usage of opium in the pre-colonial period, and often referred to, Jahangir, for example. We also have this very well-known painting of from roughly 1618, 1619, very famous painting of a prominent noble by the name of Inayat Khan, whose emaciated figure lying on a couch in the last stages of his opium addiction leading to his death. So it's sort of almost he's on the verge of his death. It's a very well-known painting. Again, you can do a Google search and you'll get Inayat Khan's painting immediately. So those were the kind of things which then became the stereotypes about opium use in pre-colonial India as an intoxicant. But how it is used in medicine, and this balancing, as you say, between benefits and risks of opium, that requires a lot more investigation. And I might add over there that I am also not sort of competent to go into too much detail on the sort of chemistry of opium. Is there any literary references other than Amitav Ghosh? Yeah, there are a few references. There's this. There are a couple of writings. There is, of course, I mentioned Rudyard Kipling's account of the Ghazipur factory, but Rudyard Kipling actually has an interesting story. I forget the title of that story. It's about a opium den. And an individual who's kind of wasting away. He's sort of narrating this story in first person about what opium did to him. So it's he's talking about the great benefits he derived from opium. But actually, it's a very tragic story, because at the end of it, everything is lost. Most of the people who come into that opium den, they are dead. So, that kind of illusion. But recently, there's also this novel which has been translated into English, the Bhojpuri novel, Phul Sungi. Phul Sungi is a Bhojpuri novel, as many of you might know, recently by Pandey Kapil, which is now available in an English translation. And in that translation, and by the way, this is again referred to by Amitav Ghosh, makes a few references to this novel in his Smoke and Ashes. And in this, one of the main characters is an important sort of British official who's socially, who's part of the social world of Chhapra, who is the head of the opium agency in the opium office in Chhapra. So there's a constant reference to what happens in the opium bungalow, what happens in the opium agency, in the opium office. So number of characters, they are closely connected. They actually they are able to get together only precisely because they work in this particular office. Although that's not the theme of the novel, but it actually it's a 1970 novel, mind you, but it's speaking of the sort of social world of Chhapra in the 19th century, and you can actually see how it reflects the prominence that opium has in the life of the everyday life of people in that area, which was a major opium producing area. So, you would find references of that sort really for opium. Yeah. So I think that's about all.
Thank you, sir, for the question answering session. And if anyone wants to ask any other question, they can unmute themselves, or they
Yeah,
can
yeah.
go to the chat box also. So we have one last
Yeah,
question.
I just want to go back to Rakhi's question, because I didn't read the full question that time. Was this complicity an act of agency within structural operation, or was it an example? I think, I went into some of those aspects. But I think, there's something else which I do feel needs a little more reflection. And that is the extent to which a large section of Indian traders were complicit in pushing this commodity into China. So that requires serious reflection. I think, in historical scholarship, that's a question which has not really been theorized. It has not really received adequate attention. And that is something we need to perhaps look at. But I'll sort of reflect a little more on this, what Rakhi has to say, because there are quite a few other things which, might be worth thinking about. Yeah, thanks for that.
And sir, can I ask one question? It's for, I have
Yeah,
one
yeah, please.
question.
Yeah, yeah, please go ahead.
So, I have that question that the legacies of the opium trade, continue to the shape contemporary global narcotics policies.
Yeah.
Can we draw the direct lines between the company's monopolization of opium and the modern war on drugs, which also collectively criminalizes and regulates drug economies for political ends?
Yeah, no, I think first, first part of your sort of question comment would be that well, the scale on which the East India Company engaged in an international trade in opium unleashed forces which were beyond the control of either the company or British colonialism. I mean, the sheer scale on which this economy, the opium economy, operated. The trade was enormous, and that even for the company became sort of the sort of historical sort of consequences of that were something that the company could not really have thought about, because from the point of view of the company, they were confining opium use to China. Again, they were confining it to China because of the requirement for tea. So it's a good commodity to sell over there. It is a commodity which they can expand that demand precisely because they can protect and patronize smuggling networks. Although they always project it as, there's this sort of inbuilt sort of liking for opium that the Chinese have. So the moment they get exposed to it, they become addicts. But in fact, what the company is doing is really making use of its power and the power of the British Navy, British naval strength to push this commodity. So its patronage becomes important for that. And thereby unleash forces. So then China starts cultivating its own opium, which became a major problem for China itself. By the 20th century, this is a major problem for China. So by the time you come to 1910, 1911, 1912, it's the entire story, the entire sort of campaign is about China. Internationally, this is a reflection of the sort of concern about what it is doing to China. And but the scale on which it was cultivated, the scale on which it was grown, the skills that became available, the knowledge of chemistry that became available, the ability to sort of produce to isolate morphine, all this then had its own sort of repercussions. To take you to the American Civil War, in fact, by the by the mid 18, I mean in 1860s, in the American Civil War, opium morphine was used as a painkiller. As you know, it's a very violent war, leads to large number of people injured, maimed, and this was supposed to be the great miracle cure, pain reliever. And the fact that it was possible to extract morphine from it was sort of became important to the dispensing opium to soldiers who were injured and civilians who were injured. But that creates its own problems, because that actually led to opium addiction on a massive scale. The Civil War opium addiction is massive. I'm talking the American Civil War, which in turn led to the exposure to this drug, and but at the same time it also showed the possibilities of producing this on a very large scale. But then let us also not forget what happened during the Vietnam War. The Americans promoted the production of opium and its derivatives on a massive scale. The patronage which earlier had been extended by the East India Company was a patronage that became available on an even bigger scale, on an even more lethal scale by the Americans during the Vietnam War, which in turn became, the basis of the drug addiction of America, with American soldiers bringing back those addictions to America. So, what British colonialism did, what the East India Company's massive trade, the scale, I just want, that's why I started by giving you some idea of the scale. And that scale is important because that has made this, it has disseminated knowledge about the cultivation, extraction, use of this drug as an intoxicant. Again, please, let's remember that this is a commodity that is sold not for its medicinal use. Even today, morphine remains in short supply for medical purposes in the world because of various kinds of problems, controls, and so on. But what the East India Company was doing was selling this as an intoxicant, very consciously as an intoxicant, as a narcotic, as a mood-altering substance. So I think this is something we need to keep in mind, that the forces that it unleashed have made things very difficult despite the criminalization. So after 1912, then there is, of course, 1925, another round of treaties and so on. Then there are the United Nations conventions. There's the 1961 single convention to which India is a signatory, which is further amended in 1972, I think. So I think, that imposes restrictions, but what colonialism unleashed is something we need to think about, the difficulties of controlling this, not in terms of just trade, but because of the very fact that information about this got disseminated so widely, practices, its chemistry. And that happened, let us remember, ultimately under the auspices of the colonial state in India and with the full backing of the British government.
Thank you, sir, for asking the questions. And thank you, sir, for joining us today and sharing your insightful thoughts and insightful lecture with us. Thank you once again, sir, for joining us and enriching us with the very important and very interesting topic. So, thank you, sir.
Thank you. I haven't been able to answer all these questions. I now can see that there are one or two things which are left out, but maybe, we'll have another occasion to discuss some of these
Thank you,
issues.
sir.
Yeah.
Obviously, sir. Obviously.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you,
Okay.
sir.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night. Bye.